The wind carved through Pine Valley like God's own blade, sharp and merciless, turning breath to ice and hope to frozen prayer. January 1886 had brought the kind of winter that killed dreams along with livestock, the kind that made strong men question their faith and weaker ones abandon it entirely. Snow lay thick as grave dirt across the Montana Territory, and in the heart of it all stood a one-room schoolhouse that should have been empty. But Lydia Bennett refused to surrender. At 24, she had already buried more than most women twice her age. Her parents, her younger brother, her entire world consumed by typhus back in Philadelphia. She had come west with nothing but a teaching certificate, a trunk full of books, and the stubborn belief that education could bloom even in the harshest soil. Now, 3 months into the worst winter Pine Valley had seen in a decade, that belief was all that kept her moving. The schoolhouse windows were glazed with ice thick as her palm. The wood-burning stove in the corner had gone cold hours ago, its iron belly empty of everything but ash and regret. Lydia's breath came out in white puffs as she carefully wrapped her most precious books in her own woolen shawl, trying to protect them from the moisture that seeped through every crack in the building's weathered walls. Her fingers, blue-tinged and trembling, traced the spine of a leather-bound copy of Shakespeare. These books were more than paper and ink. They were lifelines to a world beyond survival, bridges to something greater than the relentless struggle against cold and hunger and isolation. Outside, the storm howled like something alive and angry. Inside, Lydia Bennett stood alone in the gathering darkness, surrounded by empty desks and the echoes of children's laughter from warmer days. She didn't know that across the valley, a man was watching smoke that should have been rising from her chimney and wasn't. She didn't know that Marcus Cole had been tracking her struggle for weeks, fighting his own demons about whether to intervene. All she knew was that tomorrow somehow, she would light that stove again and wait for children who might never come. The door to the schoolhouse burst open with such force that Lydia spun around, clutching a book to her chest like armor. Snow swirled in with the intruder, and for a moment, all she could see was a dark silhouette framed against the white fury of the storm. "Ma'am." The voice was deep, rough as pine bark, carrying the weight of a man who'd grown accustomed to speaking only when necessary. "You'll freeze to death in here." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. "Sir, this is a school, not a public house. You cannot simply—" "Name's Marcus Cole." He stepped inside and pushed the door closed behind him, cutting off the wind's shriek. "I own the spread north of town, and you're the school teacher who's been trying to keep this place running without heat, food, or common sense." The insult stung, but Lydia held her ground. In the dim light filtering through the ice-crusted windows, she could make out more details of her unexpected visitor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat that spoke of prosperity, or at least practical preparation for Montana winters. His face was weathered but not unkind, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The cold stove, the wrapped books, her own pale complexion and trembling hands. "I am managing quite well, Mr. Cole," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the lie. "The children need their education, and I won't abandon my post simply because of harsh weather." Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect. "When's the last time you ate a hot meal?" The question caught her off guard. When had she last eaten anything at all? 2 days ago, maybe 3. Her supplies had dwindled to nothing, and pride had kept her from begging at any of the local establishments. "That's hardly your concern, Mr. Cole. It is when you're teaching my neighbor's children." He moved toward the stove, and she noticed something then, the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for the cold iron. Not from cold, but from something else, something deeper. "You got any wood left?" "Some," another lie. She'd burned the last stick yesterday. Marcus Cole studied her face for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her deception. Instead of calling her out, he simply nodded toward the door. "I've got a wagon outside. Wood, food, lamp oil, enough to keep this place running for a week at least." Lydia blinked. I cannot accept charity, Mr. Cole." "Not charity." His hands had steadied, she noticed, now that they had something to do. Investment. This valley needs a school, and you're the only teacher stubborn enough to keep one running through a winter like this. Before she could protest further, he was moving toward the door. I'll bring the supplies in. You get that stove ready. She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but the cold was seeping into her bones, and the thought of warmth, real warmth, made her resistance crumble. Very well, but I insist on paying you back once the weather improves and the town can resume normal operations. Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the latch. We'll discuss terms later. For the next hour, Lydia watched in amazement as Marcus Cole transformed her frozen tomb of a schoolhouse back into something resembling a place of learning. He worked with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems, carrying in load after load of split pine, arranging kindling with practiced hands, coaxing flame from tinder until the stove began to radiate blessed heat. But it was when he unpacked the food that Lydia nearly wept. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been choking down. Fresh bread wrapped in cloth that still held the faintest trace of warmth from the baker's oven. Canned peaches, salt pork, beans, flour, enough provisions to feed her for weeks. Mr. Cole, she began, her voice thick with emotion she fought to control. Marcus, he corrected, not looking up from the supplies he was arranging on her desk. And before you start thanking me, know that I'm not doing this out of kindness? She frowned. Then why? He straightened slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his gray eyes met hers directly. Because 3 weeks ago, I watched you walk 2 miles through knee-deep snow to check on the Hartley boy when he took sick. Because you've been splitting your own meager rations with children whose families can't afford to pack them lunches. And because, he paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to say. Because I know what it looks like when someone's trying to save the world, one stubborn act at a time. The silence that followed was broken only by the cheerful crackle of flames in the stove. Lydia found herself studying this man, who had appeared like some gruff guardian angel, noting the way his eyes seemed to hold old pain, the careful control in his movements, the slight tremor in his hands that came and went like a tide. You were a doctor, she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like revelation. Marcus went very still. What makes you say that? The way you move around supplies like you're used to organizing medical equipment, the way you examine the stove's flue, checking for blockages like you check airways. And your hands, she gestured vaguely. They shake when you're not using them, but steady the moment you have a task. I've seen it before, in doctors back east who served in the war. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he pulled on his gloves and moved toward the door. Keep that fire burning. I'll check on you tomorrow. Marcus, wait! But he was already gone, leaving Lydia alone with her questions and the first real warmth she'd felt in weeks. Outside, she could hear his wagon wheels crunching through the snow, carrying him back to whatever solitude he'd emerged from. She moved to the window and pressed her palm against the glass, watching his lantern light disappear into the storm. Something about Marcus Cole called to her, not romance, not yet, but recognition. He was another soul carrying wounds, another person trying to make sense of a world that had taken too much and given too little in return. As she settled into the chair beside the now warm stove, a cup of real coffee steaming in her hands, Lydia Bennett allowed herself to hope that perhaps, in this harsh valley, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The fire burned steady and bright, pushing back the darkness. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something fragile and precious was beginning to grow. Marcus Cole didn't return the next day, or the day after that. Lydia found herself listening for the sound of wagon wheels, watching the road that led to his ranch with an attention that irritated her. She was a practical woman, not given to romantic foolishness, and there was no logical reason why the absence of a man she'd known for all of 2 hours should affect her so profoundly. But it did. The children began returning to school as word spread that the building was warm again. First came little Sarah Hartley, the girl whose illness had prompted Lydia's trek through the snow. Then the Morrison twins, followed by a handful of others whose parents deemed the risk of education worth braving the weather. Lydia threw herself into teaching with renewed vigor, grateful for young voices to fill the silence and small minds to occupy her own. It was during the afternoon of the third day, as she was helping 8-year-old Timothy Morrison with his arithmetic, that the schoolhouse door opened again. Marcus Cole stood in the doorway, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, partially hidden by his broad frame, was a boy of perhaps 10 years old. The child had Marcus's dark hair and serious gray eyes, but where the man's face was weathered by experience, the boys held the guarded wariness of someone who'd learned early that the world could be dangerous. "Miss Bennett," Marcus said formally, removing his hat, "I'd like you to meet my ward, Daniel. Daniel, this is Miss Bennett, the teacher I told you about." The boy stepped forward and executed a precise bow that spoke of careful training. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Bennett." Lydia smiled warmly, sensing the brittleness beneath the child's perfect manners. "The pleasure is mine, Daniel. Would you like to join our arithmetic lesson?" Something flickered in the boy's eyes. Hunger, perhaps, for the normalcy of childhood that school represented. But he looked to Marcus before answering, seeking permission that spoke volumes about their relationship. "Go on," Marcus said gently. "I'll wait." As Daniel integrated himself shyly into the group of children, Lydia found her attention divided between her students and the man who stood quietly by the stove, watching the proceedings with an intensity that made her wonder what he was really seeing. When the lesson concluded and the other children bundled themselves up for the journey home, Daniel lingered, clearly reluctant to leave. Marcus approached slowly, and Lydia noticed again that slight tremor in his hands. "Daniel," Marcus said softly, "go wait in the wagon. I need to speak with Miss Bennett." The boy obeyed, but not before shooting Lydia a look that seemed to plead with her for something she couldn't quite identify. When they were alone, Marcus moved to the window, staring out at the landscape painted white and black by winter. "He's not my son," he said without preamble. "His parents died in a typhus outbreak 2 years ago. I was the doctor treating them." Lydia's breath caught. "Oh, Marcus, I couldn't save them." His voice was flat, emotionless in the way of someone who told this story too many times. "I tried everything I knew, every treatment I'd learned in medical school, every technique I'd picked up during the war. Nothing worked. They died anyway, and Daniel was left with no one." The tremor in his hands was more pronounced now. Lydia found herself stepping closer, drawn by an instinct to comfort that she didn't fully understand. "So you took him in." "What choice did I have?" The boy had nowhere to go, no family willing to claim him. The town was talking about sending him to an orphanage in Helena. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I couldn't let that happen, not when their deaths were my fault." "Their deaths were not your fault," Lydia said firmly. "Disease isn't a failure of character or skill. It's a tragedy, but not one that—" "You don't understand." Marcus turned from the window, and the pain in his eyes was raw, unguarded. "I was a surgeon during the war, Miss Bennett. I saved hundreds of men on battlefields where other doctors would have given up. I had steady hands, quick thinking, the kind of confidence that made impossible things possible. But after—" He held up his hands, and Lydia could see the tremor clearly now. "After I lost the Coopers, something broke. My hands shake when I try to do delicate work. My confidence is gone. I couldn't save a man from a splinter now, let alone perform surgery." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Lydia studied his face, seeing not just the pain, but the pride that made that pain so difficult to bear. This was a man who'd built his identity around his ability to heal, and that identity had been shattered along with his patients' lives. "Is that why you left medicine?" she asked gently. "I didn't leave it. It left me." Marcus moved back toward the stove, seeking warmth or perhaps just movement. "Daniel and I moved to the ranch because I couldn't bear to practice anymore. Couldn't trust myself with another life. But the boy, he still looks at me sometimes like I'm the man who could have saved his parents. If only I tried harder." Lydia felt her heart break a little for both of them. The broken doctor and the orphaned child, bound together by loss and guilt, and the fragile hope of becoming a family. "Children are resilient, Marcus. And from what I can see, Daniel doesn't blame you for his parents' death. He looks at you like you're his anchor in a storm. Maybe, Marcus's voice was doubtful, but I know what I see when I look in the mirror. A man who had everything, skill, purpose, the ability to make a difference, and lost it all because when it mattered most, I wasn't enough. The words echoed strangely in the warm schoolhouse, and Lydia realized that Marcus Cole's story wasn't so different from her own. They were both people who'd lost everything to circumstances beyond their control, both trying to rebuild meaning from the ashes of their former lives. I lost my family to typhus too, she said quietly. My parents, my younger brother James. I was supposed to take care of them, supposed to be strong enough to keep us all safe. Instead, I watched them die one by one, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Marcus went very still. I'm sorry. For weeks after the funerals, I couldn't understand why I'd survived when they hadn't, why fate had chosen to spare the least important member of the family. I came west because I couldn't bear to stay in Philadelphia, surrounded by reminders of my failure to protect the people I loved most. That's not failure, Marcus said, echoing her earlier words to him. That's survival. Lydia smiled sadly. Perhaps. But guilt doesn't always listen to logic, does it? They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two wounded souls recognizing their kinship. Outside, the wind had died down, and the late afternoon sun was painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Daniel's been asking about school, Marcus said eventually, whether he could attend regularly, not just visit occasionally. Of course he can. Any child in this valley is welcome here. Even the ward of a failed doctor. Lydia met his eyes directly. Especially him. And Marcus? You're not a failed doctor. You're a man who cared too much in a world that sometimes breaks caring people. There's honor in that, even if it doesn't feel like it. Marcus nodded slowly, though she could see he wasn't entirely convinced. I should go. Daniel will be getting cold in the wagon. As he moved toward the door, Lydia felt an impulse she couldn't quite explain. Marcus? Would you consider helping me with something? He paused, hat in hand. What kind of help? Some of the children have been showing symptoms of winter sickness. Coughs, fatigue, poor appetite. Nothing serious yet, but... She gestured helplessly. I know basic first aid, but I'm not qualified to assess whether they need medical attention. And the nearest doctor is in Helena, 2 days' ride in good weather. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. His hands tightened on his hat brim, and she could see the war between his desire to help and his fear of failing again playing out across his features. I don't practice medicine anymore, he said finally. I'm not asking you to practice. I'm asking you to care, to use your knowledge to help me keep these children safe. Marcus was quiet for so long that Lydia began to regret the request. Then slowly, he nodded. I'll think about it. That's all I can ask. After he left, Lydia remained by the window, watching his wagon disappear into the gathering dusk. She learned something important today, that Marcus Cole's wounds ran deeper than professional disappointment. He was a man haunted by the weight of expectations, his own and others, struggling to find purpose in a world that had stripped away everything he'd once used to define himself. But she'd also seen something else. The way his hands steadied when Daniel was near, the gentle patience in his voice when he spoke to the boy, the careful attention he paid to every detail of the child's welfare. Marcus Cole might not trust himself to be a doctor anymore, but he was already proving himself to be something equally valuable, a father, a protector, a man willing to shoulder responsibility for someone more vulnerable than himself. As she banked the fire for the night and gathered her things, Lydia found herself hoping that Marcus would find a way to trust himself again. Not just for the children who might need his medical knowledge, but for his own wounded spirit that deserved healing as much as any patient he'd ever treated. The schoolhouse settled into quiet darkness, but outside stars were beginning to appear in the clear winter sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for grace and growth. And perhaps, if she was very fortunate, it would bring Marcus Cole back to her door. The gossip started on a Tuesday. Lydia first became aware of it when Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, grew suddenly cool in her interactions. Where once the older woman had been friendly, even maternal, now she served Lydia with clipped efficiency and disapproving glances. By Wednesday, the change had spread to other townspeople. Conversations stopped when Lydia entered establishments, resumed in hushed whispers after she left. Women who had previously praised her dedication to the children now regarded her with suspicious eyes. It was Mrs. Carmichael, the banker's wife, who finally made the nature of their concern explicit. "Miss Bennet," she said, cornering Lydia outside the post office on Thursday morning, "I feel it's my Christian duty to speak with you about your situation." Lydia adjusted her grip on the small stack of letters in her hand. "My situation, Mrs. Carmichael?" "Your arrangement with Mr. Cole." The woman's voice dripped with false concern. "People are talking, dear, about his visits to the schoolhouse, the supplies he's been providing, the familiarity between you." Heat rose in Lydia's cheeks. "Mr. Cole has been generous in supporting the school's operations. I fail to see how that concerns anyone but myself and the children's education." "Oh, my dear child." Mrs. Carmichael's smile was sharp as a blade. "You're from back east. You don't understand how things work in a small community like ours. A single woman, alone with a man who's not her husband, well, it creates impressions, regardless of the actual facts." "The actual facts," Lydia said carefully, "are that Mr. Cole is a neighbor who has shown kindness to the school and its students. Nothing more." "Of course, dear, but you must understand how it looks to others. A widowed man with a child, a lonely woman in need of support. These things have a way of developing beyond their original intentions." Lydia felt anger building in her chest, hot and righteous. "Mrs. Carmichael, I appreciate your concern, but some of the ladies have discussed the matter," Mrs. Carmichael continued as if Lydia hadn't spoken. "We feel it might be best if alternative arrangements were made for the school's operation. Perhaps someone with a more established reputation could take over your duties." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Lydia stared at the banker's wife, understanding for the first time how quickly respectability could be withdrawn, how easily a woman's reputation could be destroyed by innuendo and assumption. "I see," she said quietly. "And what exactly would you recommend I do to address these concerns?" Mrs. Carmichael's smile turned triumphant. "Well, dear, that's really up to you, isn't it? But if your association with Mr. Cole continues as it has been, I'm afraid the school board will have no choice but to act." That evening, Lydia sat alone in her small cabin behind the schoolhouse, staring into the fire and trying to make sense of her situation. She'd come west to escape the ghosts of her past, only to find herself trapped by the moral expectations of her present. The unfairness of it burned in her throat like unshed tears. She was so lost in her thoughts that the knock on her door startled her. When she opened it, Marcus Cole stood on her threshold, his face grim in the lamplight. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. She stepped aside to let him in, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. "You've heard about the gossip." "Hard not to when half the town seems determined to share their opinions about my character and yours." Marcus removed his hat but remained standing, too agitated to sit. "Mrs. Carmichael paid me a visit this afternoon, made it clear that my continued support of the school was putting your position in jeopardy." Lydia moved to the fireplace, needing something to do with her hands. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I never intended for my problems to become yours." "Your problems?" He stared at her. "Lydia, this isn't your fault. It's mine. I should have been more careful about appearances, should have thought about how my actions would reflect on you. You were being kind, generous. The fault lies with people who choose to see impropriety where none exists." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the firelight. "What did Mrs. Carmichael tell you?" "That if my association with you continues, the school board will likely remove me from my position." The words tasted bitter. "Apparently my reputation is no longer suitable for educating children. And what do you want to do about it?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected him to apologize and withdraw, to protect his own standing by ending their fragile friendship. Instead, he seemed to be asking her to make the choice. "I don't know," she admitted. "I came here to teach, Marcus. It's the only thing I have left, the only way I know to make a difference. But if continuing means dragging you into scandal, what if there was a way to silence the gossip permanently? Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. What do you mean? Marcus took a deep breath, and she could see him gathering courage for whatever he was about to say. Marry me. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? Not, not for love, he said quickly, his hands beginning to tremble again. A practical arrangement, a marriage of protection. Your reputation would be beyond reproach, the school would be secure, and Daniel would have a mother figure in his life. Lydia stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Marcus, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. He began to pace, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the logic. Think about it, Lydia. You need security and respectability. I need someone who understands what it means to build a life from loss. Someone Daniel trusts. Someone who won't expect me to be something I'm not anymore. You're talking about a business arrangement, she said slowly. Exactly, a partnership. You'd have your own room, complete independence in all matters relating to the school and your personal life. I'd provide financial security and social protection. We'd both get what we need without the complications of other expectations. Lydia moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape while her mind raced. The proposal was logical, practical, utterly sensible. It was also the most unromantic thing she'd ever heard. What about Daniel, she asked. How would he feel about this arrangement? He adores you already. Having you as a permanent part of his life would be a gift, not a burden. And what about, she struggled to voice the question, what about the possibility that someday one of us might want something different, someone else? Marcus was quiet for so long that she turned from the window to look at him. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral. I'm not capable of offering more than what I'm proposing, he said finally. The war, losing patience, the responsibility of raising Daniel, it's taken everything I had to give. I can offer you friendship, respect, partnership, but love, romance, the things a woman like you deserves, I don't have those to give anymore. The honesty in his voice was more heartbreaking than any declaration of devotion could have been. Lydia saw him clearly then, not as a romantic hero or savior, but as a wounded man doing his best to protect the people who'd become important to him. How long would you need to consider it, he asked. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to think clearly. Marcus, this is not a decision to be made lightly. No, it's not. But Mrs. Carmichael made it clear that the school board meets Monday. If we're going to do this, it needs to be done before then. 4 days. 4 days to decide whether to bind her life to a man she barely knew. To enter a marriage that would provide security, but potentially deny her any chance of true love. If I agreed, she said carefully, what would the actual terms be? Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. I've drafted a contract. Basic terms, mutual obligations, provisions for, he hesitated, for ending the arrangement if circumstances change. She took the paper with trembling fingers, skimming the neat handwriting that laid out their potential future in cold legal language. Separate quarters, financial provisions, educational responsibilities, mutual respect and discretion. It was everything she needed and nothing she'd ever dreamed of. I'll need time to think, she said finally. Of course. But Lydia, he moved toward the door, then paused. Whatever you decide, know that I respect you more than any woman I've ever met. This proposal isn't charity or pity. It's recognition of your strength, your character, your worth. You deserve better than what I'm offering, but if you'll accept it, I promise to honor the trust you'd be placing in me. After he left, Lydia sat by the fire with the contract in her lap, weighing her choices as the clock ticked toward an uncertain future. Security versus possibility, practical protection versus romantic hope, a marriage of convenience that might become a prison, or a partnership that might grow into something neither of them expected. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in fresh, white silence. By Monday, one way or another, her life would be irrevocably changed. The only question was whether she had the courage to choose certainty over dreams. The wedding took place on Saturday morning in the pastor's study, with only Daniel and Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, as witnesses. Lydia wore her best blue dress, the same one she'd worn to her brother's funeral, and carried a small bouquet of winter pine that Daniel had gathered for her. Marcus stood beside her in a black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the gravity of his expression. When Pastor Williams asked if they took each other as husband and wife, they both answered with quiet, practical affirmation. The kiss that sealed their union was brief, formal, no more intimate than a handshake between business partners. Afterward, they signed the papers in careful silence. Mrs. Patterson offered congratulations that rang hollow in the small room, and Daniel watched the proceedings with the solemn attention of a child who understood that something important was happening, but couldn't quite grasp what it meant for his future. "Well then," Marcus said when the formalities were complete, "I suppose we should head home." Home. The word struck Lydia as strange. For months, home had been her small cabin behind the schoolhouse, a cramped space filled with books and solitude. Now, apparently, home was Marcus's ranch, a place she'd never seen, shared with a man she'd married for protection rather than love. The ride to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Daniel sat between them on the wagon seat, occasionally pointing out landmarks or animals, but even his natural chatter seemed subdued by the weight of the day. Lydia found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, noting the careful management of the land, the quality of the fencing, the well-maintained buildings that spoke of prosperity and attention to detail. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with wide windows and a covered porch that overlooked the valley. It was neither grand nor rustic, but something in between, comfortable, solid, built to last. "Your room is upstairs," Marcus said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Second door on the right. I've had Mrs. Santos, she helps with cooking and cleaning, prepare it for you." Lydia nodded, acutely aware of the awkwardness of the situation. She was now mistress of this house, stepmother to Daniel, wife to a man who'd made it clear he expected nothing from her beyond practical partnership. Inside, the house was warm and well-appointed, decorated with simple furniture and a few feminine touches that spoke of the woman who'd lived here before. Catherine's presence lingered in small ways. An embroidered pillow on the sofa, watercolor paintings of wildflowers on the walls, a basket of mending beside the fireplace. "I can have those things removed," Marcus said, noticing her attention to the decorative details. "No," Lydia said quickly. "They're lovely. Daniel should grow up surrounded by reminders of the woman who would have been his adoptive mother." Something flickered across Marcus's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Catherine would have liked you," he said quietly. "She believed in education, in the power of books to change lives." That evening, as Lydia unpacked her belongings in the spacious room that was now hers, she reflected on the strangeness of her situation. She was married but not in love, a mother but not a parent, mistress of a house that belonged to the memory of another woman. The bed was comfortable, the fireplace adequate, the view from her window breathtaking in its scope and beauty. She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt hollow. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Marcus with some practical detail about their new arrangements. Instead, Daniel appeared in the doorway, still dressed in his wedding clothes but with his hair mussed and his expression uncertain. "Miss Lydia? I mean, Mrs. Cole?" The boy stumbled over her new name. "Are you really going to live here now?" "I am," she confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed and patting the space beside her. "Is that all right with you?" Daniel perched carefully on the mattress, his legs swinging. "I think so. Marcus said you might help me with my reading and that you know lots of stories." "I do know stories. Would you like to hear one?" His face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. "Yes, please." So Lydia found herself telling Daniel about King Arthur and his knights, about bravery and honor, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As she spoke, she watched the tensions leave the boy's small frame, saw him relax into the rhythm of narrative the way children always did when they felt safe and valued. "Do you think Marcus is like a knight?" Daniel asked when she finished. The question caught her off guard. What makes you ask that? He saved me when my parents died. And he saved you from the cold. And he always tries to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Out of the mouths of babes. Lydia studied Daniel's earnest face, seeing in it the wisdom that sometimes came to children who'd experienced loss too early. Yes, she said finally. I think Marcus is very much like a knight. The kind who doesn't seek glory or recognition, but who does what needs to be done because it's right. Daniel nodded solemnly. And you're like a princess in a tower, except instead of waiting to be rescued, you rescue other people by teaching them. Where did you get such ideas? Lydia laughed. Books, Daniel said matter-of-factly. Marcus has lots of them in his study. He reads to me sometimes, when his hands aren't shaking too much to hold the pages steady. The casual mention of Marcus's condition reminded Lydia that this child had already learned to navigate around adult fragility with the careful attention of someone much older than his years. Daniel, she said gently, you know that Marcus's shaking hands don't mean he's weak or broken, don't you? Sometimes people's bodies remember difficult experiences even when their minds are trying to move forward. The boy nodded gravely. Like how I sometimes have bad dreams about when Mom and Papa were sick. Exactly like that. Marcus saw a lot of difficult things when he was a doctor, and his hands remember even when he doesn't want them to. Will they get better? Lydia considered the question carefully. I don't know, but I think that with time and care and people who love him, Marcus will find his way to feeling stronger. Just like you're getting stronger every day. Daniel seemed satisfied with this answer. He hugged her goodnight with the fierce intensity of a child claiming a new source of security, then padded back to his own room down the hall. Lydia sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking about knights and princesses and the strange fairy tale her life had become. Outside her window, she could see the lights of Pine Valley twinkling in the distance, including the schoolhouse where she'd continue teaching, now as Mrs. Marcus Cole instead of Miss Lydia Bennett. It was a beginning, she told herself. Not the beginning she'd imagined, but a beginning nonetheless. The crisis came 3 weeks later. Lydia was in the middle of a geography lesson when young Tom Brewster began coughing. Not the ordinary cough of a child with a winter cold, but the deep, racking cough that spoke of something more serious. By the time his older sister walked him home, his face was flushed with fever and his breathing had grown labored. That evening, Lydia mentioned the incident to Marcus over dinner. His reaction was immediate and alarming. His fork clattered to his plate, and his hands began trembling so violently that he had to clasp them together in his lap. Describe the cough, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Lydia gave him the details she'd observed, watching as his face grew pale. Marcus, what is it? It could be pneumonia, or worse. He stood abruptly, began pacing the length of the dining room. Someone should examine the boy properly, assess his symptoms. The nearest doctor is in Helena. It would take 2 days to get him here. Then the boy could be dead by the time help arrives. Marcus's voice cracked with frustration and something deeper, the old guilt that had driven him from medicine. Marcus! Lydia rose and moved toward him, her voice calm but firm. You could examine him. He stopped pacing, turned to stare at her as if she'd suggested he perform miracles. Number, I told you, I don't practice anymore. I can't. You can't perform surgery anymore, she corrected. But you can still recognize illness, can't you? You can still offer guidance, even if someone else has to implement it. Your hands shake when you're anxious, but they steady when you have a purpose. I've watched you, Marcus. When you're focused on a task, when you're helping someone, the tremor disappears. He stared at her for a long moment, conflict warring across his features. And if I'm wrong? If I miss something crucial, if the boy dies because I gave bad advice, then at least you'll have tried. And if you're right, if you can help, then Tom Brewster lives to see another spring. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Finally, Marcus nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. I'll need my medical bag. It's in the study, in the trunk beneath the window. An hour later, they stood in the Brewsters' modest cabin, watching as Marcus examined young Tom with gentle professional thoroughness. Lydia was amazed to see the transformation in her husband. Gone was the uncertain, guilt-ridden man she'd married. In his place was the doctor he'd once been, confident and capable despite the slight tremor in his hands. Pneumonia, he confirmed to Tom's anxious parents, but caught early enough to treat if we're aggressive about it. He prescribed treatments that Lydia carefully wrote down: steam inhalations, specific positioning to help clear the lungs, herbal teas to reduce fever, signs to watch for that would indicate either improvement or deterioration. Most importantly, he gave Tom's parents hope, not false reassurance, but the kind of realistic optimism that came from medical knowledge and genuine care. "You'll need to monitor him closely for the next 48 hours, Marcus told them. "If his breathing worsens or the fever spikes higher, send for me immediately." On the ride home, Marcus was quiet, but Lydia could sense a change in him, a loosening of the rigid control he'd maintained around his medical identity. "You were magnificent in there," she said finally. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Every moment, I was afraid I'd forgotten something crucial, missed some vital sign. But you didn't. You saved that boy's life tonight." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "We saved his life. I couldn't have done it without you there, writing everything down, asking the right questions, keeping me grounded." The word hung between them. We. Not I, but we. A partnership that went beyond their legal marriage contract, beyond the practical arrangement they'd agreed to. "Marcus," Lydia said carefully, "what if this doesn't have to be the end? What if you could practice again, in a limited way? Not surgery, but general medicine. The valley needs a doctor, and you need to heal." "I need to heal," he repeated slowly, as if testing the truth of the statement. "You've been punishing yourself for 2 years for failing to save the Coopers, but tonight, you saved Tom Brewster. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself and find a way forward." 3 days later, Tom Brewster was sitting up in bed, demanding his mother bring him extra portions at meals. The pneumonia had broken, his fever was gone, and his breathing was clear. Marcus stood in the Brewsters' doorway, accepting their tearful thanks with characteristic modesty, but Lydia could see the change in his posture, the way he carried himself with something approaching his old confidence. "Dr. Cole," Mrs. Brewster said, pressing his hands between hers, "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Marcus replied. "Just keep him warm and make sure he finishes all the medications, even when he starts feeling better." Outside, as they walked back to their wagon, Lydia slipped her hand through Marcus's arm. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily since their wedding, and she felt him startle slightly at the contact. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Marcus looked down at her, something shifting in his gray eyes. "I couldn't have done it alone." "You didn't have to. That's what partnerships are for." They drove home in comfortable silence, but Lydia was acutely aware of the warmth of his arm beneath her hand, the way the setting sun caught the silver in his dark hair, the quiet strength that radiated from him when he wasn't fighting his own demons. For the first time since their wedding, she allowed herself to wonder what might be possible between them if they stopped hiding behind the practical terms of their arrangement and started building something real. That night, Marcus knocked on her bedroom door. "Come in," she called, expecting some household matter that needed discussion. Instead, he entered carrying a small potted plant, a rose bush with a single red bloom just beginning to open. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting it on the table by her window. Catherine loved roses. She said they proved that beautiful things could grow even in harsh climates if they were tended with enough care. Lydia stared at the flower, understanding the symbolism he was offering. "It's beautiful." "Lydia," he said, his voice uncertain, "what happened today, working together to help Tom? It felt like something I'd been missing. Not just the medicine, but the partnership. Having someone who believes in me enough to push me past my fears." She turned to face him fully. And I'm wondering if maybe our arrangement could be more than what we originally agreed to. Not immediately," he added quickly, "but gradually. A real partnership, not just a practical one." Lydia's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying that I'm starting to hope for things I thought I'd lost the right to want. And I'm asking if you might be willing to explore the possibility of something genuine between us." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing vulnerability there that he'd never shown before. This was not the broken man who'd proposed a marriage of convenience, but someone who was beginning to heal, beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness again. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Marcus smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him since their wedding day. "Then we'll take it slowly, build something together that's worth more than the sum of its parts." As he left her room, Lydia touched the soft petals of the rose, thinking about growth and possibility and the strange ways that life could surprise you. She'd married Marcus Cole for protection and security, but perhaps with patience and care, she might find something infinitely more valuable. Love that bloomed slowly was often the strongest kind, and in the harsh climate of Montana Territory, she was learning that the most beautiful things were worth waiting for. By May 1886, the transformation was complete. Pine Valley had shed its winter coat of snow and ice, revealing meadows carpeted with wildflowers and streams running clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. The schoolhouse was warm and welcoming now, filled daily with the laughter of children whose parents no longer worried about their teachers' respectability. And in the Cole household, something fragile and precious was blooming alongside the roses in Catherine's garden. It hadn't happened overnight. The shift from practical partnership to genuine affection had been gradual, built on shared meals and evening conversations, on watching Marcus's confidence return as he began treating sick animals and eventually, carefully, sick people again. He'd opened a small practice in town, nothing like the full medical career he'd once pursued, but enough to feel useful again, to know that his knowledge could still serve a purpose. Lydia had been his anchor through the process, encouraging him through setbacks, celebrating small victories, helping him see that healing others was also healing himself. In return, Marcus had given her something she'd never expected, a sense of belonging, of being valued not just for what she could provide, but for who she was. "Mrs. Cole," young Sarah Hartley called out during the morning geography lesson, "is it true that you and Dr. Cole are going to have a baby?" The question came so unexpectedly that Lydia nearly dropped the chalk she was holding. "Sarah, wherever did you hear such a thing?" "My mama said she saw you talking to Dr. Morrison in town yesterday, and that you look like ladies do when they're expecting." Heat flooded Lydia's cheeks. Dr. Morrison was the traveling physician who visited Pine Valley once a month, and she had indeed spoken with him yesterday, but about ordering medical supplies for Marcus's practice, nothing more. "Sometimes adults discuss many different topics," Lydia said carefully, trying to regain her composure. "Now let's return to our lesson about the Mississippi River." But Sarah's innocent questions stayed with her throughout the day, mainly because it forced her to confront something she'd been trying not to think about: the growing intimacy between herself and Marcus, and where it might lead. Their marriage had slowly evolved from sleeping in separate rooms to sharing quiet conversations by the fireplace each evening, from formal politeness to gentle teasing and genuine laughter, from careful distance to casual touches, his hand on her back as he passed behind her chair, her fingers briefly covering his when she handed him his coffee cup. They hadn't spoken of love, hadn't crossed the physical boundaries they'd established in their original arrangement, but the awareness was there, simmering beneath every interaction, building with each shared glance and moment of connection. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Daniel play with a litter of puppies in the yard, Marcus brought up the subject that had been occupying Lydia's thoughts all day. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that there was some interesting conversation at the schoolhouse today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Lydia sighed. "Children and their questions. Sarah Hartley seems to think we're expecting a child." "And are we?" The question was asked so quietly that for a moment Lydia thought she'd imagined it. When she looked at Marcus, however, she saw that he was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Are we what?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. "Are we, that is, should we be thinking about—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Lydia, I'm not very good at this kind of conversation." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where a man tells his wife that he's fallen in love with her and wants to know if she might feel the same way." The words hung in the evening air between them, simple and honest and utterly transformative. Lydia felt her breath catch, felt the world shift slightly on its axis. "Oh," she said inadequately. Marcus turned to face her fully. "I know this isn't what we agreed to originally. I know you married me for protection, not romance. But these past few months, watching you with Daniel, working beside you, seeing the way you've helped me find my way back to medicine, Lydia, you've given me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever." "Marcus, let me finish," he said gently. "I love the way you read stories to Daniel, putting different voices for all the characters. I love how you hum while you're correcting papers, and how you always save the last piece of pie for whoever needs it most. I love your fierce protection of your students and your stubborn refusal to give up on anything or anyone you believe in." Tears pricked at Lydia's eyes. "Including you. Especially me." His voice was rough with emotion. "You believed I could be a doctor again before I believed it myself. You saw something worth saving in a broken man, and you refused to let me give up on healing others or myself." "You were never broken," she said firmly. "Wounded, yes. Hurting, but not broken. I know that now, because of you." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Daniel chase the puppies across the grass as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I need to tell you something," Lydia said finally. "I didn't just marry you for protection, Marcus. I married you because even then, even when we barely knew each other, I recognized something in you that called to something in me. I was falling in love with you before I understood what was happening." Marcus reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "And now I'm completely, utterly, hopelessly in love with you." She laughed softly. "Which is terrifying and wonderful and nothing like what I expected when I came to Montana." "What did you expect?" "Loneliness, mostly. A quiet life of teaching children and trying to make peace with loss. I never expected to find a home, a family, a man who makes me want to believe in happy endings again." Marcus lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "So where does that leave us?" "Wherever we want to be," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "We could continue as we have been, taking things slowly, building on what we've discovered, or ... Or we could acknowledge that we're both adults who found something precious together, and we could stop pretending that separate bedrooms make sense anymore." The directness of her statement clearly surprised him. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from handsome to devastating. "Mrs. Cole," he said formally, "are you proposing to seduce your own husband?" "I believe I am, Doctor." "Cole, are you amenable to such a proposition?" Instead of answering with words, Marcus stood and offered her his hand. "Daniel's staying the night at the Hartley's farm," he said quietly. "Something about helping with the new foal." "How convenient," Lydia murmured, allowing him to help her to her feet. "I may have made those arrangements this afternoon," Marcus admitted, "when I realized I couldn't spend another night lying awake, thinking about the woman I love, sleeping alone down the hall." Hand in hand, they walked into the house, leaving behind the careful boundaries they'd maintained for months. That night, in the privacy of Marcus's bedroom, their bedroom now, they finally claimed each other completely. Marcus was gentle but passionate, reverent in his exploration of her body, patient with her inexperience, generous with his attention and affection. When he made love to her, it was with the thoroughness of a man who'd waited a lifetime to find the right woman, the dedication of someone who understood that the best things were worth savoring. Afterward, they lay entwined in the lamplight, talking softly about everything and nothing, sharing the intimate conversations that belong to lovers, discovering each other's hearts and minds as well as bodies. "I want to give you children," Marcus said, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "If you want them, if you're willing to share that with me." "I want everything with you," Lydia replied, surprised by the truth of it. "Children, a future, growing old together, all of it. Even though it means staying in Montana, building a life here, instead of eventually returning east?" Lydia considered the question, thinking of the life she'd left behind. The elegant Philadelphia society that had never truly accepted her, the memories haunted by loss and disappointment. Then she thought of Pine Valley, of the schoolhouse where she was making a real difference, of Daniel, who'd become the son of her heart, of Marcus, who'd shown her what love could be when it was built on respect and partnership as well as passion. Especially because it means staying here, she said firmly. This is home now, Marcus. You and Daniel and this place we're building together. I don't want to be anywhere else. Summer passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Marcus's medical practice grew as word spread about his gentle manner and skilled treatment. Lydia continued teaching, but now she also helped manage the ranch and serve as Marcus's unofficial nurse when he needed an extra pair of hands. Daniel thrived under their combined attention, growing taller and more confident with each passing week. And in late August, Lydia realized she was pregnant. She told Marcus on a warm evening as they sat in Catherine's rose garden, watching the last light fade from the sky. His reaction was everything she'd hoped for: joy, wonder, and just a touch of the protective concern that made her love him even more. "Are you happy?" he asked, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once," she admitted. "Are you?" "I'm the luckiest man in Montana Territory," Marcus said firmly, "maybe in all of America." They made love that night with even greater tenderness than usual, acutely aware of the new life growing between them, the family they were creating from love and choice, and the kind of persistent hope that could survive any winter. As Lydia drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, lonely, grieving, convinced that her best days were behind her. She could never have imagined then that loss could lead to such unexpected joy, that a marriage of convenience could become the greatest love story of her life. Outside their window, the roses bloomed in wild profusion, proof that beautiful things could indeed grow in harsh climates when tended with enough care. And inside, three people who'd found each other against all odds were creating something even more beautiful: a family built on love, forgiveness, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today. February 1887 arrived with a gentleness that surprised everyone in Pine Valley. The winter had been mild by Montana standards, with steady snow, but none of the brutal storms that had characterized the previous year. As Lydia entered her 9th month of pregnancy, she found herself grateful for the cooperation of both weather and timing. "You're nesting," Marcus observed one morning, finding her reorganizing the linen closet for the 3rd time that week. "I'm organizing," she corrected, though she knew he was right. The urge to prepare, to ensure everything was perfect for the baby's arrival, had become almost compulsive. "The baby's room has been ready for 2 months," Marcus said gently, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on her rounded belly. "The cradle is finished, the clothes are washed and folded. We have enough supplies to stock a small hospital." "Are you saying I'm being excessive?" "I'm saying you're going to be a wonderful mother, and our child is the luckiest baby in the territory to have you waiting for him or her." Their child. Even after months of pregnancy, the reality sometimes still amazed Lydia. This tiny person growing inside her was the product of love freely given and joyfully received, living proof that second chances were possible even when you'd stopped believing in them. "Dr. Morrison says it could be any day now," she said, leaning back against Marcus's chest. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but excited too. I keep imagining what the baby will look like, whether we'll have your eyes or mine, your stubbornness or my tendency to worry about everything." "Hopefully my height and your good sense," Marcus murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The labor began 3 days later, on a crisp Tuesday morning when the world was painted white with fresh snow. Lydia was grading arithmetic papers when the first contraction hit, strong enough to make her pause but not painful enough to cause alarm. By afternoon, however, there was no mistaking what was happening. Marcus sent Daniel to stay with the Hartleys and transform their bedroom into a makeshift delivery room with the efficiency of a man who'd assisted at countless births during his medical career. "I should send for Dr. Morrison," he said, though they both knew the traveling physician was 2 days away in Helena. "You've delivered babies before," Lydia reminded him, gripping his hand as another contraction peaked. "I trust you more than any other doctor." "That was different. I wasn't emotionally involved then." Despite the pain, Lydia managed to smile. "You'll be fine, Marcus. Your hands are steady when they need to be, and right now, they need to be." As if responding to her confidence in him, the tremor that sometimes affected Marcus's hands disappeared entirely. For the next several hours, he was purely the doctor, calm, competent, focused entirely on ensuring the safe delivery of their child. Lydia had heard other women describe childbirth as the most painful experience of their lives, but she found that while the contractions were intense, they were also purposeful. Each wave of pain brought their baby closer to arrival, closer to the moment when their family would finally be complete. "I can see the head," Marcus announced, his voice tight with concentration and wonder. "One more push, my love." With a final surge of effort, Lydia brought their child into the world. The baby's first cry was strong and indignant, a perfect sound that filled the room with joy and relief. "It's a boy," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lydia, we have a son." Their son, small and red-faced and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proclaimed his displeasure at being forced from his warm, comfortable home into the cold world beyond. Marcus performed all the necessary medical tasks with practiced efficiency, cutting the cord, checking the baby's reflexes, ensuring both mother and child were healthy. But Lydia could see tears on his cheeks as he worked, could hear the tremor of emotion in his voice as he announced that everything was perfect. "Let me hold him," she said, reaching out with arms that shook from exhaustion and overwhelming love. The moment her son was placed on her chest, everything else faded away. The pain of labor, the worry about complications, the ordinary concerns of daily life, none of it mattered. There was only this, a perfect baby boy who was half her and half Marcus, living proof that love could create miracles. "Hello, little one," she whispered, stroking the baby's soft cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his medical bag forgotten, watching his wife and son with an expression of such profound happiness that it took Lydia's breath away. "What should we call him?" he asked softly. They'd discussed names for months, considering family names and meaningful choices, but looking at their son now, only one seemed right. "James," Lydia said firmly. "James Marcus Cole. For my brother who I lost, and for the man who saved us both." "James Marcus Cole," Marcus repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like it. A strong name for a strong boy." The next few hours passed in a blur of wonder and exhaustion. Mrs. Santos arrived to help with the immediate necessities, bringing soup and clean linens, and the kind of practical assistance that allowed new parents to focus on marveling at their child. Daniel returned home that evening, wide-eyed with excitement at meeting his new baby brother. "He's so small," Daniel whispered, carefully touching James's tiny hand. "Are you sure he's going to be okay?" "He's perfect," Marcus assured him, "and he's very lucky to have such a good big brother to look after him." That night, as their son slept peacefully in the cradle beside their bed, Marcus and Lydia lay awake talking in hushed tones about the future. "I keep thinking about the man I was when we first met," Marcus said, broken, convinced I'd lost the right to heal anyone, certain I'd never be worthy of love or family again. And now I'm holding my wife in my arms, listening to my son breathe, thinking about how Daniel's already planning to teach his brother to ride horses. Now I understand that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about love, second chances, the willingness to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Lydia turned in his arms, studying his face in the dim lamplight. "You saved me too, you know, from loneliness, from giving up on the possibility of happiness, from believing that the best parts of my life were over." "We saved each other," Marcus corrected, "and now we get to save James from ever doubting that he's loved and wanted and precious beyond measure." 3 months later, on a warm May morning, when the roses in Catherine's garden were blooming in wild profusion, Lydia stood on the porch of their home holding James, while Marcus and Daniel worked in the corral with a young colt. The scene was so perfectly ordinary and yet so precious that she had to blink back tears of gratitude. Her son was growing strong and healthy, already showing signs of his father's determined personality and his mother's curiosity about the world around him. Daniel had embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm, constantly offering to help with feeding and diaper changes and the thousand small tasks that came with caring for an infant. And Marcus had found his way back to wholeness through medicine and love and the daily miracle of family life. His hands still shook occasionally when he was nervous, but they were steady when they needed to be. When he was examining a patient, holding his son, or touching his wife with the reverence of a man who understood the preciousness of the gifts he'd been given. "Mrs. Cole?" Sarah Hartley's voice interrupted Lydia's reverie. The girl was now 12, old enough to serve as Lydia's occasional helper with the baby. "Doctor, Cole says to tell you that Mrs. Patterson's baby is coming, and he needs his medical bag." Lydia smiled, remembering another birth, another crisis that had brought Marcus back to medicine and ultimately back to himself. "Tell him I'll bring it right away." As she gathered Marcus's supplies and prepared to accompany him to assist with another delivery, Lydia reflected on the strange ways that life could surprise you. She'd come to Montana Territory as a failed teacher, running from grief, convinced that her best days were behind her. She'd married Marcus Cole for protection and respectability, never dreaming that their practical arrangement could bloom into the deepest love of her life. But perhaps that was how the best stories always unfolded. Not according to plan, but according to grace. Not through careful preparation, but through the willingness to remain open to unexpected possibilities. James gurgled happily in her arms, completely unaware that his very existence was proof of miracles. Evidence that love could indeed conquer winter storms and heal the deepest wounds. Around them, Pine Valley stretched out in all its spring glory, a testament to the truth that beautiful things could grow in the harshest climates when tended with enough care. And in the Cole household, three souls who'd found each other against all odds were discovering daily that the best chapters of their lives were still being written, one moment of grace at a time. So many threads woven together, lost transformed into love, broken hearts mended through patience and care, two wounded souls who discovered that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from building a future worth embracing. Marcus and Lydia's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with simple human kindness. A man offering firewood to a freezing woman, a teacher believing in a doctor who'd lost faith in himself. Two people choosing trust over fear, hope over safety, love over the comfortable numbness of solitude. Their marriage of convenience became something far more precious, a partnership built on respect, strengthened by shared purpose, and blessed with the kind of love that grows deeper with each passing season. Have you ever found love in an unexpected place? Have you witnessed the healing power of someone believing in you when you'd stop believing in yourself? We'd love to hear your stories of second chances, of love that blooms slowly but surely, of families formed not just by blood but by choice and commitment. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Are you in a bustling city dreaming of simpler times? Or perhaps in a small town where neighbors still look out for each other? Your stories inspire us to keep bringing you these tales of hope and healing. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories of ordinary people finding extraordinary love. Tomorrow brings another tale from the frontier, another reminder that the human heart is capable of healing even the deepest wounds when tended with enough care. Until then, remember that sometimes the best things in life come not when we're desperately searching for them, but when we're busy building something meaningful with our own hands. Love has a way of finding those who've learned to tend their own gardens well. Keep believing in second chances and keep watching for the unexpected miracles that bloom in the most unlikely places.